I sat in my car outside the house I had called home for 25 years, gripping the steering wheel so tightly. Through the large bay window, I could see her, Lily, my daughter, laughing as she flipped through bridal magazines with her mother. My wife. My family. Or at least, they used to be. 25 years. A lifetime. I had been there for her first steps, her first words, her first bike ride, holding on to the back of her seat, running alongside her, breathless, until she finally pedaled on her own, beaming with pride. I was the one who picked her up from school when she was sick, who stayed up all night helping her build science projects, who sat through every excruciating middle school play with a camcorder in hand, pretending she was Broadway material. When her first boyfriend broke her heart, she curled up in my lap and sobbed into my shirt like she was 5 years old again. I was the one who tucked her in at night. I was the one who paid for the braces, the dance lessons, the summer camps. The one who cheered the loudest at her college graduation, swallowing the lump in my throat when she threw her arms around me and whispered, "Thank you, Dad." And now, here I was, sitting outside in the cold like a stranger peering into a life I no longer belonged to. I should have felt happiness watching her plan her wedding, but something gnawed at my gut. A cold, creeping unease. I didn't know why, not yet. I opened the glove compartment and pulled out an old photograph, one of the many I carried but never showed anyone. It was from her 8th birthday party. She was missing a front tooth, grinning at the camera while holding the puppy I had surprised her with. Her arms were wrapped tightly around my neck, her face full of love. Unquestioning. Uncomplicated. How had we gotten here? The living room lights flickered as my wife got up and crossed the room, saying something I couldn't hear. Lily's face shifted, something hesitant, something almost guilty. The unease in my gut twisted tighter. I didn't know what was coming, but I could feel it. A storm in the distance, just beyond the horizon. I placed the photograph back in the compartment, shut it, and rested my forehead against the steering wheel, exhaling slowly. For the first time in my life, I felt like a man standing on the outside, looking in. I was in the middle of fixing the sink when my wife called out from the living room, her voice filled with that particular excitement that made you drop everything, knowing something big was coming. "Mark, come here. Lily has something to tell us." I wiped my hands on a rag, shaking off the cold water as I made my way toward them. Lily was perched on the couch, her whole face glowing, eyes bright, hands clutched together in her lap, like she was physically trying to contain her joy. "Dad," she beamed, bouncing slightly in place. "I'm engaged." I froze. For a second, all I could see was the chubby little girl in pigtails standing on her bed, twirling in the too big wedding veil she had stolen from her mother's closet. "One day, Daddy," she had giggled, spinning. "I'm gonna marry a prince." I had laughed, scooping her up, pressing a kiss to her forehead, and telling her that any man who wanted to marry her had to go through me first. And now, here she was, 25 years old, no longer twirling in a veil, but sitting before me as a grown woman, wearing an engagement ring that flashed under the soft glow of the lamp. I should have been ready for this moment, but damn if it didn't knock the wind out of me. "Sweetheart," I said, forcing myself to move, to breathe, to close the distance between us. God, that's incredible." I pulled her into a hug, feeling the weight of the years in my arms. The little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest, the teenager who had slammed doors in my face, the young woman who had finally found her own way. And now, she was getting married. I pulled back, grinning. "Tell me about him. I want to know everything." She laughed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, Dad, you're gonna love him. His name is Jason. He's an architect, and he's just the sweetest guy." My wife clapped her hands together. "And he proposed in the cutest way. Tell him, Lily." Lily held up her hand, wiggling her fingers as the diamond caught the light. "We were on a trip to the mountains, and we hiked up to this gorgeous lookout point. Right as the sun was setting, he got down on one knee and," she sighed dreamily, "it was perfect." I smiled, ignoring the pang in my chest. My little girl was grown, getting married, starting a life that didn't include bedtime stories, scraped knees, or me checking the closet for monsters. But this was good. This was right. "You know," I said, nudging her shoulder, "I always knew I'd have to rough some guy up one day for stealing my little girl. But if he makes you happy, That's all I need to hear. Lily smiled, but there was something else there now. A flicker of hesitation. Something small but unmistakable. Yeah, about that. I tilted my head. About what? She opened her mouth, closed it, then laughed nervously. Oh, nothing. It's just, we're still working out some details. But don't worry, you're gonna love the wedding. The unease from the other night returned, curling at the edges of my mind like smoke. Of course I will, I said, forcing my voice to stay light. It's your wedding, sweetheart. Just tell me where to be, and I'll be there. She relaxed, nodding. Good. Because it's going to be perfect. I believed her. Or at least, I wanted to. I still remember the exact moment it happened. The way the warm glow of the restaurant lights cast a golden hue over Lily's face. The gentle clinking of silverware against plates. The low hum of conversation from other tables. It was supposed to be a simple family dinner, just the three of us. A small celebration for her engagement before the chaos of wedding planning took over. Lily was twirling pasta around her fork, talking about floral arrangements, seating charts, and the absolute nightmare of picking bridesmaid dresses that wouldn't cause a civil war among her friends. I listened, smiling, sipping my whiskey slowly as I let her excitement wash over me. Then, mid-sentence, she hesitated. Just for a second. A quick flicker of uncertainty in her eyes before she set her fork down, exhaling as if she was preparing herself for something. Dad, she said, looking up at me. Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. I hope you understand, but I want my real father to walk me down the aisle. Everything stopped. The restaurant noise faded into a dull, distant hum. My heartbeat slowed to a heavy, measured rhythm. For a second, I wondered if I had misheard her. My real father. I had been expecting something. Maybe a change of plans, maybe some ridiculous wedding tradition she wanted to follow, but not this. Not this. I forced myself to blink, to breathe, to keep my hands relaxed around my glass. She was watching me carefully, her lips pressed together, as if bracing herself for an argument. Maybe even for me to get angry. But anger wasn't what I felt. I felt nothing. An empty, echoing kind of nothing. The kind of nothing that comes right before something breaks. I nodded once, slowly setting my drink down. Of course, sweetheart. Lily's shoulders dropped in relief. Oh, good. I didn't want you to be upset, you know? It's just, he's my biological father, and I feel like this is something he should do. It's tradition, and I didn't hear the rest. Not really. I just sat there, nodding occasionally, pretending to listen as she justified her decision. Her real father. The man who hadn't been there when she had nightmares and crawled into our bed. The man who hadn't stayed up all night helping her study for finals. The man who hadn't held her hand through heartbreaks or taught her how to drive or stood in the audience for every milestone of her life. But sure, he should have this moment. I smiled, even as something inside me turned to ice. You're right. It's a special moment. I wouldn't want to take that away from him. Lily's face lit up. You're the best, Dad. Dad. The word felt hollow now. My wife reached over and squeezed my hand, giving me a silent look of appreciation. Like I had done something noble. Like I had made the right choice. I swallowed back the taste of bitterness. No anger. No argument. Just a simple nod. But beneath the surface, something shifted. A crack in the foundation. And I knew, deep in my bones, I wasn't done yet. The house was a whirlwind of wedding chaos. Dresses, floral arrangements, guest lists, caterers, every surface covered in fabric swatches and calligraphy-printed menus. And in the center of it all was Lily, glowing with excitement, her voice carrying through the house as she talked about finalizing details. I stood in the doorway, watching. I had been a ghost in my own home for weeks. No one excluded me outright. There was no official conversation where I was told to stay out of the way. But that was the thing about being phased out. You don't get an announcement. You just slowly fade into the background, and one day, you realize no one is looking for you anymore. I wasn't asked to help pick the venue. I wasn't consulted on the menu, the music, or the guest list. But he was. Her real father. I first saw him at the dress fitting. Lily was standing on a platform, the boutique's mirrors reflecting her in a stunning white gown. My wife dabbed her eyes, whispering about how beautiful she looked. And then he walked in. Tall. Salt and pepper hair. A suit that probably cost more than my mortgage. He strode in like he belonged there, clapping his hands together with an easy grin. "There's my beautiful girl." Lily's face lit up. She turned to him, beaming. And that's when I felt it, the shift. The replacement had begun. I stood at the back of the room, hands in my pockets, watching as he swept her into a hug. He murmured something to her, and she laughed, her eyes shining. Then he turned, offering a firm handshake. "Mark, right?" he said smoothly. I nodded. He patted my shoulder. "Hey man, I just want to say, I really appreciate you being so understanding about all this. I know it's a big deal for a father to walk his daughter down the aisle." I smiled. A polite, measured smile. "Of course." Lily looked between us, clearly relieved. "I knew you guys would get along. Isn't he great, Dad?" I nodded again. "Seems like it." And then, just like that, I was dismissed. I wasn't needed in the dress fitting, or at the cake tasting, or when they picked out the first dance song. He was, though. He stood beside her at meetings, offered his opinions, got introduced to vendors as the father of the bride. I overheard my wife on the phone, telling someone how gracious I was being, how mature I was for stepping aside. I heard guests at the engagement party whispering, "It's really big of him, you know? Letting her real dad have this moment." Letting. As if I had a choice. I played my part perfectly, smiling at the right moments, nodding at the right conversations. I stayed on the sidelines like a good, quiet spectator. But inside, something cold and sharp had begun to take shape. I wasn't angry. Not yet. But I was watching. I stood in front of the mirror in the upscale men's boutique, adjusting the cuffs of a deep charcoal suit. The fabric was smooth beneath my fingertips, the tailoring precise. It wasn't flashy, not the kind of suit you'd expect from a father giving a wedding toast. No, this one was different. Understated. Formal. The salesman hovered nearby, eager to make a sale. "This is an excellent choice. Timeless. You'll look great in the wedding photos." I smiled politely. "It's not for the wedding." His expression flickered with curiosity, but he nodded and stepped away. I paid in cash. Didn't want any credit card records. From there, I went downtown. Not to the wedding venue. Not to the tailor for final adjustments on my tux. To my lawyer's office. The receptionist greeted me with a warm smile, flipping through her schedule. "Ah, Mr. Callahan. Right on time. He's ready for you." I stepped into the office, a quiet, wood-paneled space with bookshelves lined with legal tomes. My lawyer, a man I had known for over a decade, gestured toward the chair across from him. "Mark," he said, folding his hands on the desk. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon. Everything okay?" I nodded, setting a thick folder onto the desk. "I need to make some changes." Effective immediately. His eyes sharpened with curiosity. "To what exactly?" I slid the folder toward him. "Everything." He flipped it open, scanning the contents. His brow furrowed. "Are you sure about this?" I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. "Absolutely." We discussed details, documents, finalizations, legal transfers. By the time I walked out of that office, there was no turning back. One last stop. I found the perfect box in a small, high-end boutique. It was sleek, elegant, black velvet with a gold clasp. The kind of box that made you hold your breath before opening it. I took it home, sat at the kitchen table, and carefully placed the final piece inside. Then I snapped it shut. I sat there for a long time, running my fingers over the edges, feeling the weight of it in my palm. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I looked around, at the framed family pictures on the wall, at the chair where I used to sit when Lily did her homework, at the living room where we once put up Christmas trees together. It didn't feel like home anymore. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wedding band. I turned it between my fingers for a moment before setting it down next to the box. Then I stood up, took one last look at the life I had built, and walked away from the table. The wheels were in motion now, and no one, not Lily, not my wife, not her real father, had any idea what was coming. The wedding venue was breathtaking. A sprawling estate on the outskirts of town, its manicured gardens bursting with flowers in full bloom. White chairs lined the aisle, draped in soft, flowing fabric. The air buzzed with chatter and laughter, a symphony of joy and celebration. I arrived unnoticed, blended in. A dark suit, a quiet presence, Just another guest in a sea of faces. No one was looking for me. Not Lily. Not my wife. And certainly not him. I took a seat near the back, where no one would bother to check if I was even there. The ceremony hadn't started yet, but the energy in the air was electric. People murmured about the decorations, the weather, the beautiful bride, and the proud father. I heard his name more times in those 10 minutes than I had in the past 25 years. Oh, it's so wonderful that they reconnected. She looks just like him, doesn't she? He must be so proud to walk her down the aisle. I stayed quiet, watching the stage being set. Then the music changed. The guests hushed. And there she was, Lily, my little girl, dressed in white, glowing under the soft golden light. Her veil trailed behind her, her hands clasped around the arm of the man standing beside her. Him, her real father. He walked her down the aisle with a wide, beaming smile, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who had earned this moment. As if he had been there through the sleepless nights, the school drop-offs, the scraped knees and bedtime stories. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just watched. Every guest turned their heads, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. They saw a father, a daughter, a moment of pure love. But what they didn't see, what no one saw, was the man sitting in the back row. The man who had been there for 25 years, who had given everything and now sat in silence, forgotten. I should have felt pain, regret, maybe even anger, but all I felt was clarity. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the small, elegant box I had brought with me. I traced its edges, feeling its weight. The ceremony continued. Vows were exchanged, promises made. Lily's voice trembled with happiness as she said, "I do." The guests cheered. The biological father swelled with pride. And me? I smiled. Because none of them, not a single person in that room, knew what was coming next. The ceremony moved like a dream, the kind of picture-perfect moment people captured in glossy wedding magazines. The sun hung low in the sky, casting everything in warm, golden light. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, making the white drapes sway gently. The guests sat in hushed anticipation, their eyes fixed on the couple standing beneath the floral arch. Lily's groom, Jason, stood tall, his voice steady as he spoke his vows. "I promise to love you with every part of me, to stand beside you in joy and in hardship, to cherish you for all that you are and all that you will be." There was a sniffle from the front row. Someone dabbed at their eyes. The moment was beautiful, heartfelt, cinematic. Then it was Lily's turn. She took a deep breath, clutching Jason's hands, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "Jason," she began softly, "from the moment I met you, I knew you were the one. You make me feel safe, seen, and completely loved. I promise to always stand by your side, through every challenge, every joy. You are my best friend, my love, my forever." There was a collective sigh from the guests. A few soft ahs. The officiant smiled warmly, ready to declare them husband and wife. And still, I sat there, silent. I had barely moved throughout the entire ceremony, my hands resting in my lap, fingers brushing against the small velvet box in my pocket. The weight of it felt heavier now. I turned it between my fingers absently, my expression unreadable. No one was looking at me. No one had even checked if I was here. Their attention was on him, the father of the bride. He stood tall beside Lily, his hands clasped in front of him, pride radiating from every pore. He had already given his blessing, already played the role of the devoted father, the right father. The officiant lifted his hands. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jason, you may kiss your bride." A cheer erupted as Jason leaned in, pressing his lips to Lily's. The guests rose in applause, the sound of celebration filling the air. I watched it all unfold. A perfect wedding, a perfect day, and they had no idea. No idea that the man in the back row wasn't clapping. No idea that the moment they thought was the peak of the day was only the calm before the storm. I gripped the small box tighter, my jaw set. The time was coming. Soon. The reception was a flawless continuation of the wedding, grand, elegant, the kind of event that people would talk about for years. The venue glowed under golden chandeliers, laughter and music weaving together in a symphony of celebration. Guests clinked their glasses, waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and Lily, radiant in her gown, floated from table to table, basking in the warmth of the people who loved her. Or at least, the people she chose to love. I remained at my table, unnoticed, a quiet observer. The small velvet box still rested in my pocket, its weight grounding me. I had barely touched my drink. The toast began. First, the maid of honor. A heartfelt, tearful speech about childhood memories and lifelong friendship. Then the best man, cracking a few jokes before raising his glass. Then he stood up. The biological father. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and smiled broadly. He held his champagne flute with the casual confidence of a man who believed he belonged here, who believed he had earned this moment. He turned to Lily, his eyes warm, fatherly. "Lily," he said, voice thick with emotion, "from the moment I saw you in that wedding dress, I knew today was going to be one of the greatest moments of my life. You were everything a father could hope for, kind, brilliant, strong, and beautiful." The guests let out a soft, collective sigh of admiration. "I may not have been there for every moment," he continued, his voice taking on a practiced humility, "but I have always loved you. And standing here, watching you begin this next chapter with Jason, I can say with certainty that I have never been prouder." Lily's eyes glistened with tears. She reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Dad." The word Dad hit like a gunshot. A few guests turned to look at me, their expressions unreadable. But most didn't. Most didn't even think about me. I wasn't part of the story anymore. The applause that followed was warm and genuine. A moment that would be remembered. The man who abandoned her. The man who never paid a cent toward her future, who never stayed up at night worrying about her, who never once lifted the weight of fatherhood, he got the speech. I got silence. The final toast was coming. The last chance to honor the couple, to mark the end of the speeches before the real celebration began. There was a lull as the guests took their seats, sipping their drinks, expecting the next person to stand. That's when I rose from my chair. The sound of it scraping against the polished floor was loud in the sudden quiet. Heads turned. I picked up my glass. "I wasn't asked to give a speech," I said, my voice calm. "But I'd like to say a few words." The room shifted. A ripple of surprise. Uncertainty. I reached into my pocket. My fingers curled around the box. Lily's face froze. The air in the room changed. The storm had arrived. I took my time walking toward the center of the room, my footsteps echoing slightly in the stunned silence. The air had shifted, thick with an unspoken tension that only a few people in the room were beginning to recognize. Lily's face was frozen in place, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to stop me, but didn't know how. I clinked my glass lightly, just enough for the sound to cut through the murmurs and lingering laughter. I wasn't asked to give a speech. I began, my voice calm, measured. "But I'd like to say a few words." A beat of silence. Then polite smiles, the kind you give when you're not sure if you should be worried yet. I turned my head slightly, meeting the biological father's gaze. He was still smiling, but it wasn't as confident as before. His fingers tapped idly against his glass, as if debating whether or not to interrupt. I looked away. He didn't matter anymore. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small black velvet box. Lily's breath hitched. I placed it in front of her, setting it down gently on the table. "This is my final wedding gift to you." The room fell utterly, completely silent. The kind of silence that suffocates. Lily stared at the box like it might explode in her hands. "Go ahead," I said softly. "Open it." She hesitated, looked at Jason, then at her mother, who was sitting stone still, fingers curled into a tight fist on her lap. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Lily reached forward and unlatched the box. The lid lifted. Gasps rippled through the room. Inside was a thick stack of neatly folded papers, documents, checks, receipts, hospital bills, tuition payments. At the very top, a single handwritten letter. Lily's hands shook as she picked it up, her eyes scanning the first few lines. Her lips moved, forming words too quietly for anyone else to hear. Then her expression changed. The realization hit her like a train. Her fingers tightened around the letter. Her breath came faster, uneven. She glanced at me, panic flashing across her face. "Dad," I gave her a slow, almost imperceptible shake of my head. She kept reading. Lily, I never wanted to say this. I never wanted you to know. Because a real father doesn't need credit. He doesn't need recognition. He doesn't need to be thanked for doing what a father should do. But today, I realized something. You never saw me at all. So here it is. The price of raising you. The cost of every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every hour of work that went into making sure you never had to struggle. Every check I wrote, every bill I paid, every moment I stood in the background so you could shine. Your real father? He never paid a dime, never lifted a finger. But today, he got the only thing I ever wanted, the chance to be seen as your dad. And that's fine, sweetheart, because this is my final gift to you. Not just the money, not just the years. I'm giving you freedom. You don't owe me anything. I'm done. The letter slipped from her hands, fluttering onto the table. No one spoke. No one moved. Lily's face had drained of all color. Her real father sat frozen, his jaw clenched, his eyes flicking over the documents. Over the undeniable, inescapable truth. I reached for my drink, took a slow sip, and set it back down with a quiet clink. Then I looked at Lily, truly looked at her, one last time. And I smiled, because I had just given her something no one else ever had. A consequence. Lily's hands trembled as she stared at the letter in front of her. Her face, once flushed with the glow of celebration, had gone pale, her breath coming in uneven, shallow gasps. She looked like she wanted to say something, but no words came. The guests sat in stunned silence. The clinking of silverware and the hum of quiet conversation that had filled the room just moments ago had vanished, leaving behind only a thick, suffocating tension. I watched as she slowly reached for the stack of documents beneath the letter. The first was a canceled tuition check from her freshman year of college. Then another, and another. Then hospital bills from when she broke her wrist in high school. Credit card statements from the debt her real father had abandoned her and her mother with when she was just a child, paid in full. More receipts, more proof, more truth. Every page she flipped sent another ripple of shock through the room. People leaned in, whispering in hushed, disbelieving voices. She reached a childhood photo of us. A simple moment. Her, maybe 8 or 9, asleep on my chest on the couch after a long day. My arm wrapped around her, holding her close. She pressed a hand over her mouth. Her fingers were shaking so badly, she nearly dropped the papers. I exhaled slowly, watching the moment unfold exactly as I knew it would. Across the room, her biological father sat frozen, his face darkening by the second. I could see the barely concealed panic in his eyes as guests turned to him, their expressions shifting. They were realizing that the man they had clapped for, the man they had cheered on, the man who had stolen my place at that altar, had never actually been there at all. Lily finally lifted her head, her eyes searching for mine. Dad. Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. I let the silence stretch between us. I wanted her to feel it. I wanted her to understand. I picked up my glass, took a slow sip, and set it down carefully. Then I met her gaze, steady and unshaken. I just wanted you to know what Dad truly meant. Gasps broke out across the room. A ripple of stunned disbelief spread through the crowd. A few guests turned to each other, murmuring. Others simply gaped. The biological father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He wasn't smiling anymore. The confidence, the easy charm, gone. Because now, the entire room saw him for what he was. A fraud. And me? I was still standing. I was still the real father. And there was nothing he could say to change that. Lily sat frozen, her fingers still clutching the letter like it was the last thing tethering her to reality. The blood had drained from her face, leaving her pale, her lips parted as if she wanted to say something. Anything, but no words came. Her eyes darted wildly between me and him. Her real father. Or at least, the man she had thought was her real father. The guests weren't clapping anymore. They weren't smiling. The once festive air of the reception had turned suffocatingly still, filled only with the quiet murmurs of people realizing, piece by piece, what had just happened. A woman near the front whispered, "Oh my God." An older man at the next table, an uncle, maybe, shook his head, muttering under his breath, "My wife." ex-wife, if we were being technical, sat stiffly in her seat, her expression unreadable, her fingers curled tightly around her napkin. She wasn't looking at me. Or Lily. No, she was looking at him. At the man she had once called a mistake. The man who had left her, left us, to pick up the pieces of a life he never wanted. The man she had welcomed back with open arms the moment it was convenient. The biological father swallowed thickly, straightening his shoulders as he tried to salvage whatever scraps of dignity he had left. Listen, I didn't know about any of this, he said, forcing a shaky laugh. Lily, sweetheart, you know I love you. This doesn't change anything, okay? Lily turned to him, her expression still blank, still unreadable. It doesn't. He reached for her hand, but she flinched. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I caught it, and so did everyone else. His face tightened. His fingers curled into a fist before he quickly masked it with another fake, easygoing chuckle. Look, what does it matter? We're all here now, aren't we? That's what's important. No one responded, because they all knew. It mattered. Lily looked down at the documents again, her breathing uneven. Her hands were shaking as she skimmed over the tuition payments, the canceled checks, the receipts, the proof. Her entire world was tilting, cracking, breaking. She had spent the last year erasing me from her story. She had invited a ghost from her past to take my place, convinced herself it was the right thing to do, that I was just a stand-in, that he was the father she was meant to have. And now she had to face the weight of what she had done. I let the silence stretch, let her sit with it, let her feel the weight of the choice she had made. Then, slowly, deliberately, I nodded once. That was it. No anger, no yelling, no demands for an apology, just a simple nod. I set my glass down with a quiet clink against the table. Then, without another word, I turned and walked away. No one stopped me. No one called after me. Because for the first time all night, they finally saw me. And it was too damn late. I walked slowly, deliberately, through the silent reception hall. My footsteps echoed against the polished floor, each step carrying the weight of 25 years. No one spoke. No one stopped me. The laughter, the music, the celebration, all of it had died the moment that black velvet box opened. I passed tables of stunned guests, their champagne flutes frozen midair, their wide eyes darting between me, Lily, and the man who had just been exposed for what he was. The biological father sat rigid, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping the edge of the table like a man desperately trying to hold on to whatever dignity he thought he had left. But there was nothing left for him to cling to. His moment of triumph had turned to ash. The weight of reality had crashed down on him, just as it had on Lily. She was trembling now, barely breathing, her hands still gripping the papers, the receipts, the proof of every sacrifice I had made, of every debt I had paid in silence, of every burden I had carried so that she never had to. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. She looked like she wanted to stand, like she wanted to run after me, to say something, anything, but she couldn't move. Because she knew. She knew. There was nothing left to say. I reached the doors. The cool night air hit me like a cleansing wave as I stepped outside. The sound of the world returned. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of trees, the distant hum of traffic on a nearby road. I exhaled slowly. Then I kept walking. My car sat alone in the parking lot, away from the neatly arranged rows of vehicles belonging to the guests still trapped inside that reception hall, drowning in the fallout of what had just happened. I slid into the driver's seat, shutting the door with a quiet thud. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. The man looking back at me wasn't the same man who had arrived hours ago. That man had been hopeful, maybe even foolish, thinking he could endure this day, thinking he could sit through the humiliation, the quiet erasure of everything he had been, and walk away unscathed. But I wasn't unscathed. I had been burned down to the foundation. And yet, I felt lighter, lighter than I had in years. I reached into my pocket one last time. My fingers curled around my wedding band, the last remnant of the life I had built, the life I had given. I turned it between my fingers, let it catch the light. Then, without hesitation, I rolled down the window and flicked it into the night. It landed somewhere in the grass, swallowed by the darkness. I started the engine. The low rumble filled the quiet. And then, without looking back, without a single glance toward the reception hall, toward the people I had once called my family, I drove away. Alone. But finally free.